Hey guys, so it's that time of year again where people are starting to have exams and I know how bad that is. I finished college last year and I chose not to go into university, but I do have some revision tips for any of you struggling or feeling nervous about exams. I did pretty well in mine. I found that I forgot how to revise, which was really odd. And I remembered in my last exam of college, of the 2 years of A-levels, and it was so frustrating. I mean, I didn't watch YouTube at the time and I've since actually seen some really helpful videos. I thought I'd try and make my own with some of my own tips that I found helped me, and in all of the exams I've actually followed these tips and remembered them. I've got you know, A stars, A's and B's, so hopefully you think I'm credible. So my first thought is sources of revision. So some people are good at taking notes, but most people who I know aren't, and a lot of the time you look back over your notes and you don't understand what you've written. You've written it in some kind of shorthand version thinking, oh, I'll remember exactly what that means. If you're one of those lucky intelligent people who has perfect notes and understands it all and it's all colour coded and neat, then this probably doesn't count to you as much. But if you're like me and most people in the world, this might be useful for you. Now these are for if you're in the UK, specifically doing GCSEs or A-levels. I don't really know about other countries, obviously, because I've never lived in another country, so again this might not be for you, this part, but the rest of the tips will hopefully help you regardless of where you live. So some sources. For you, if you're doing your GCSEs, BBC Bitesize is amazing. It pretty much got me through my GCSEs, especially maths, which I was terrible at. It's really helpful. It's good because you learn about the sections and then you take a test at the end, like a short test, and see what you have learnt. And I think that's a really good way of doing it, and they give you the key stuff that you need to know. I find a lot of the time when you're using textbooks or notes, you end up learning a lot of stuff that you don't actually need, and it's taking up room in your brain that you could use for things that you do need. So if you're doing your GCSEs, I think that BBC Bitesize is a really helpful website to use, and I really do highly recommend it. I will link all of these sites that I mentioned below because you might not know where they are, but you could just Google them. So if for whatever reason you can't use Bitesize, you know, you're not doing your GCSEs or the subject that you're doing isn't on Bitesize, then obviously the next thing to use is textbooks. Now I try to avoid textbooks where I can. Obviously they are necessary sometimes, especially when you're doing A-levels. I find there is a hell of a lot of information in it that is just irrelevant. If you do want to use textbooks, I recommend using a highlighter in them if they are your own. Try to get your own textbook so that you can use a highlighter rather than making notes, which takes so much longer. I made the mistake of doing that and it took me about, you know, it would be hours just to revise a chapter, and it's not worth it. And highlight all the key information you need to know, so key names, especially names you've heard in your lessons but aren't 100% sure what they do, or terms that you've heard in your lessons and you're not so sure what they do, because it honestly will come in useful even if you just flick back the day before your exam and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that now. Finally, if you've used Bitesize and or textbooks and your notes and you've talked to people and everything else and you're still stuck, or even if you're not and you just want to make sure that you know everything, I really recommend using the Student Room. The Student Room is a forum for students, and there's loads and loads from all around the UK. I think it's UK based, I don't know, they might have stuff other countries as well, but it's definitely UK based. They have people talking on the different exams, and this was a saviour for me because I found it in my last year of college before my second to last exam, and they were talking about the exam, the specific syllabus that I was doing in detail, and you can find posts like that on the Student Room for pretty much anything, and it helped me so much because I was really stuck and confused. There were bits I did not understand, there were bits that I couldn't work out how I would incorporate it into an essay. I didn't know the essay structure for some of my part of my subject, and it was awful, and I had like 3 days until the exam, and I found this thread on the student room about beliefs in sociology. I read the entire thread from the beginning till the end, and I got an A in the exam because of that thread, because they explained everything really well. Everyone was asking questions, and they often ask what you've got. I wasn't a member of the forum, I just read it from the outside. But you can sign up yourself and ask your own questions that you have, and it's just a really, really, really useful resource, and if you can use that, you really should. I honestly think that it saved my exams, and I would have done a lot worse without it, so I'm really pleased that I found that when I did. And I would definitely recommend looking for your subject on it, especially if your subject's one that's either it's quite complicated and there's a lot to learn, because they tend to explain to you what you really need and what is superfluous. And also if you have a more obscure subject, so Student Room is brilliant. Next, now we've got resources out of the way, I will talk about the process of revision. So I know it's drummed into you so much how to revise and that you have to find your own way of doing it, but it's really, really tough to find your own way of revising because it is different from everyone. And at my school we were always told to do mind maps and everything else, and I never did, and then when I for some reason decided to try them out in my A-levels, I didn't do so well in the subjects I used them for. They're not for me. They don't help me memorise anything at all. They just confuse me and take up time. So, you know, for me that isn't a good thing to do, but for you maybe it is. But like I was trying to say, we're told so much how to revise and everything else, so I wasn't originally going to go over this, but I thought that it's worth just explaining to you how I personally found it best to revise, just in case you're really struggling and you're at the end of your tether and you just think, I need something, I'm just stuck and I don't know how to even start, and maybe this will help you. So the first thing is to come up with a revision timetable. Now, you can't use this for procrastination. I did this so much where I would come up with a timetable, I would do it for a couple of days, realise it didn't quite work, so I'd do a completely new timetable, and it would take me like a couple of hours per timetable, and it was a really great way to just procrastinate from actually doing revision, and it was just a waste of time. But it did help. Once I finally stopped just redoing it, it did help. It meant that I was revising the subjects that I needed to revise when I needed to do them, and not concentrating on a subject that perhaps I didn't have the exam until later, but I found the subject easier, which is really tempting to do because it makes you feel better because you know all the stuff already. But really you should try and do the stuff that's nearer first, whether it's harder for you or not, because it will be a lot easier in the long run, if that makes any sense. So always start with the stuff that you find most difficult within a subject. Start with the subjects that are nearest. So say you had 5 exams, you had 2 of them at the end of May and 3 of them in the middle of June, then start with the ones that are at the beginning of May, end of May, and start with the stuff in the subject that you find most difficult. So if you're doing maths and you find algebra really tough but you get geometry, don't start with geometry because you already know that, you can already do that, you just need to go over it near the time of the exam to make sure there's nothing you've missed. Start with algebra and really learn how to do it, however hard it is, which comes to my next point. Break each individual subject into bite-sized chunks, so into sections. For example, if you're doing English literature, break it into different stories and poetry, or whatever it is your syllabus asks you for, and then within that revise in like a time scale order. It just seems so much more manageable because that way you sit down for a revision session and you know exactly what you're revising that day, so definitely know what you want to revise and when. You can also that way make sure that it all fits in before your exam, otherwise you find that the exam comes and you still haven't revised certain parts because you've been too busy doing other things which really you didn't need to do. If you have a lot of stuff to learn, then go over all of it as much as you can and then go back to things, because otherwise something that you haven't even looked at might come up in the exam and then you're screwed. And so I think that's the most important way to do it. Next, at the end of each session, ask yourself questions about what you've been revising. I find that this is probably the most helpful thing, because that way you know whether you've learnt it or not, and don't ask yourself questions you know the answers to. Think of the things that you've looked at and covered in your revision that day and ask yourself questions about that. If there's questions already in a textbook or online, then even better, but you can set yourself questions that you do have to think about. You can set them before or whilst you're going along if you want, as you come across things, or you can set them after. It's up to you. Just make sure you answer questions about what you've learnt, because it actually really helps you realise, I haven't quite done as much of that as I needed to, I still don't understand this or that, I need to come back to it. Or conversely, I get everything about that, that's fine, I'll just quickly read over it for the exam. It's great, all done. That, for me, that was one of the most helpful things in my exams, especially the ones I found more difficult, like maths, because it showed me what I'd learnt and whether I could do the necessary equations and whether I knew what I needed to, knew the information I needed. So I really do recommend doing that. I don't like doing practice exams. A lot of teachers will set you like an essay question and you have to write out an essay. I think that is pointless, because it takes a long time. A lot of the time, if you don't know the information, you end up looking it up in a textbook. I think it's better to just do little questions, even if your exam is an essay. Little questions to see what you've learnt, because that way you're going to remember it and you'll be able to incorporate it into your essay, which is what you need to do. So next and finally is to take plenty of breaks during your revision. So don't just sit down and revise solidly for 12 hours or whatever, because you're just going to burn yourself out. Apparently you can't learn anything beyond 90 minutes. That's the point when your brain goes, nope, that's it. And I think for a lot of people it's less. For me, it's about 45 minutes I can solidly concentrate for before I begin to drift away. And if you're not just concentrating on what you're doing, you're not really going to learn what you need to. So don't revise any longer for 90 minutes and take a 15-30 minute break in between each revision session. Get outside. The weather is so nice at the moment, and you've got to waste it to get what you need to for your exam, but go outside in between sessions. Go outside every 45 minutes for just a little while, get something little to eat, get some fruit or a drink, go for a walk, go for a cycle. What I used to do was I would revise like 3 subjects a day for about an hour. An hour in the morning, each subject, an hour in the afternoon, each subject. And then for a couple of hours in the middle of the day I would meet up with my friends, and that's just a really great way to break up the monotony of revision, have something to look forward to, and get outside, get some fresh air, and just stop sitting hunched over a desk or wherever you revise, because it's not good for you and your brain does begin to shut off, and then you just don't learn anyway, so it's quite pointless doing it like that. So that are all my suggestions for the process of revision. The next are just random other tips which I personally found helpful, and you might find them helpful too.